Mohamed Tal is a clinical psychologist and also a psychoanalyst practicing in Dubai. He is also an associate researcher at the University of Dundee, School of Humanities and Social Science. He has completed his master's degree in the clinical psychology in the University San Jose de Beirut, and his PhD actually here in Ljubljana. The topic was theoretical psychoanalysis. So I was also on the committee, so I know this work quite well. Since the foundation of the École libanaise de psychanalyse et de psychothérapie, Mohamed was an active participant in this association. He contributed to its teaching through seminars between 2018 and 2021. And his passion, which is clearly there for understanding the complexity of psychoanalytic practice, led him to explore the concept of the end of analysis, topics that he really develops deep in, following his dissertation in his book, The End of Analysis, The Dialectics of Symbolic and the Real, a really good book which I warmly recommend, published last year. Please, Mohamed.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real honor to be here. It's basically here where this work has been done on the end of analysis. And most of the people who contributed to it are here today. So it's quite moving and overwhelming to try to depart from it in some synthesized argument to reflect on the question of the continuation of analysis. I would like to depart from the fact that the question of the continuation of analysis is not just a matter that is posed at the end of an analysis or under the framework of Passe, but it's a question that, I mean, whenever it comes to the practice of analysis, I ask myself every day. And I mean, I'd like to share with you something that happens every day. When I drive to the clinic, I'm asking myself, how the hell is this going to continue? You know, and on the way back, I feel a little bit more relieved that, well, something of it has continued. You know, and especially in a space like in Dubai, such a context which is not where I practiced originally. I practiced in Beirut, then moved to Dubai. So especially in a place like Dubai, where the space for speech is very particular. So I think we can depart from a very basic idea that the question of how analysis can be continued is not a question posable about analysis, it is the question of analysis, it is internal to analysis. And I think one of the first technical indications that Freud made are precisely targeting this. When it comes to the rule of free association, basically one of the ways it can be translated is that let's not take what we spoke about last time as a knowledge, as a theory, as a diagnosis. Let's play this game again. Let's not build on it as a conclusion. And on the other side, there is the evenly suspended attention from the side of the analyst, which Lacan will formalize into the analyst's desire to know, and which translates into basically the analyst never being able to to get away with his desire to know, never able to conclude on something. So there is on both sides of the analysis, there is always this engagement with the end in a way that always tries to make it an on-end, a renewal. I mean, we can add to that also a related element, which is Freud's recommendation to handle every session as if it was the first, which is to be grasped in both dimensions. On the one hand, to see the analysand as if it was the first time we're seeing him, but also to operate analytically as if it was the first time that we operate as analysts. Try to reinvent the way we can operate as analysts. Well, a second site, just to introduce the topic, is fundamental, I think, which is the debate between Freud and Ferenczi, which is historical. And it's the main site in the history of psychoanalysis where the question of the end has been posed so passionately, either at the level of the analysis of Ferenczi with Freud as at the level of the theoretical engagement with the topic of the end of analysis. And basically, we can summarize it very, very briefly into two wagers where Ferenczi tells Freud, well, you haven't continued my analysis till its end. So here we have a continuation until the end. And Freud's answer is that, well, basically this is half of the problem. There's another side, which is that it continues after the end. So the end is itself a modality of its continuation. It is a cut that makes it repeat. And of course, Ferenczi formulated this wager in his idea of that the end of analysis is an acceptance of castration, liquidation of transference, and all of that functioning as a sort of successful mourning, which are all concepts taken from Freud originally, but where Freud advanced them, they were openings, they were gaps in something, and somehow in Ferenczi's wager we see them as rather being totalized as a kind of solution. I will not enter into all of this, but this is just to put some grounds for the entry into the matter of La Passe. And of course, Freud's response to that is basically in this name of the article, the very famous article, analysis terminable and interminable, in a way that associates that, well, the termination of one analysis is precisely when analysis has become interminable. That somehow this ending of one analysis is a renewal, and a renewal that goes boundless. And I think one very interesting detail is where within this argument, and this is an element I haven't really put in this thesis, the book, which I discovered a little later, is that this is a moment where Freud, along those lines, introduces this recommendation, but I mean, he had introduced it before, but here he voices it out as a commandment for every analyst to undergo analysis again every 5 years. And he had introduced this before, but a little bit from this early progressive mindset of Freud, which is that the unconscious cannot be uncovered in one go, that there is always some material to be discovered and so on. But here, in analysis terminable and within this argument of the end being a non-end, somehow Freud commands us to resubmit to analysis and resubmit analysis to analysis, from another dimension of this inexhaustibility of the unconscious, which is also and mostly related to the inexhaustibility of analysis itself, in the sense that analysis is in constant reinvention. With every analysis, analysis is being reinvented, re-amended, and with that there is a different articulation. It can operate even to the same material. So already Freud puts us on the track of a certain dealing with the question of continuation, which is a very specific version that analysis continues by repeating, by repetition, except that by a cut that is introduced with every cycle of this repetition. And he's fiercely against any of the propositions that are of the type that there is an end that ends repetition. On the contrary, it's engaging with repetition. Its analysis takes repetition as its most trustable ally, in a way. So now I will move to Passe, and I'm going to introduce Passe and then go back to the end of analysis, or the end of analysis. So Passe is, I'm not going to work a lot on the historical context of Passe. It's quite obvious. There is the traditional didactic system that has been operating before Lacan and with Lacan, which Lacan presented an amendment to, and which can basically simplify it by saying that an analysis was didactic because the one who was the analyst was a didactician. So it was a kind of schema of descendants. And at a certain point, Lacan was himself one of those didacticians, then he was thrown out. But rather than this being a didactic schema or a new didactic schema that is made to provide proof of a passage of the analysand to the analyst, rather than this broad view of Passe as a selection of the analysts of the school, it kind of contains a doubling down on Freud's wager. Like he makes it even doubled, that not only the analyst is to resubmit to analysis, but analysis itself. In the sense that wherever there is a passant presenting his testimony, speaking about what was his analysis, there is something that is being produced in this testimony, which provides to a jury that is collecting those testimonies a certain amendment, a certain axiom, a concept that amends the analytic discourse that is held within the jury and within the institution. So basically, this is how we can understand that when Lacan calls it as an experiment whose experimenter is its very object. The experimenter being the jury, and it's the jury that is the object of Passe. It's the jury that is being somehow interpreted, or the discourse of the jury that is being interpreted. So let us put the framework of this. Basically, there is an analysand who has come to a moment of destitution at the end of one analysis. And this moment of destitution is, well, I've tried to work quite a lot on it in this book to make it less sexy than it was in the Lacanian field. It's not that sexy, you know, because it has been kind of, but it's a moment of production, let's say, a moment where the analysand is at the most brutal encounter with the very division in the real, and where he has to produce something out of it. And somehow the framework of this production is three partners who are three passers with whom he has an exchange for a while. And it's not a short one. It used to go on for sometimes for years. And then those passers are going to go report his testimony to a jury of agreement, and the jury of agreement. One detail before we move further is that it's also through this testimony about what was his analysis that he can formulate a construction that translates his desire that translates his analysis into analytic act. And here, by saying this translation into analytic act, it's not the end of the analysand and the start of the analyst, but it's rather him being able, the analysand being able to relate to analysis, no longer only by the desire of his analyst, but also by his own desire of the analyst. So, so the crucial question of the testimony and of the Passe in general is not what is analysis, because it's not really posable. It's rather what was analysis, what functioned up to that point in terms of what revealed itself to have been an analysis. And this very particularity of the question posed in this sense is precisely what allows us to see through a certain transition, that by the moment I can formalize what was an analysis, analysis is no longer that. It can depart again from the beginning, but with a cut, that it's no longer this. So the whole point of this staging of the question is allowing a formalization that would make not only the analysand submitting to this procedure, but also the jury with him, to enter analysis again, departing from a different point. And this is important to note, that this is not really a model of transmission by which something is being transmitted and builds one layer over the other. It's rather a schema where what is being staged is a rupture, is a cut. And this cut is precisely what allows us not to transmit psychoanalysis, but rather to reinvent it, to go through it again. So it's by advancing this axiom that the jury has to pick up, presenting an amendment, presenting a a cut that allows this new beginning, that somehow a new problem can be posed by analytic thinking, leading to the admission of this analysand, passant, as an analyst of the school. And here, by saying analyst of the school, it's the analyst who has managed to analyze something of the school by this advancement. Which is to compare, if we want to go back to those appellations, les appellations, to compare to the analyst member of the school. The analyst of the school is not a member. He has analyzed the school. And I'd like to just just a little, a couple of specifications there that, I mean, given this, how this story unfolds, I mean, it's the passant who's interpreting the discourse, the analytic discourse of the jury, so it's not really the passant who is the passant. And neither is the jury a jury, because in a way he's embodying this discourse of analysis that needs to be renewed, that needs to be interpreted. And Lacan puts a beautiful phrase in the end of the October proposition, which kind of condenses all of this. And it was basically aiming to speak to the analysts who were contesting La Passe as a procedure. He calls them the technicians. You know? So I quote, "Let the assembly of technicians know that it is not a question of contesting authority, that La Passe, I'm not just messing with authority, but of removing it from fiction." So basically, the whole point is actually to scrutinize this discourse of the master, to remove it from fiction by producing gaps in it through those testimonies of the passants, and inverting the discourse of the master back into a discourse of the analyst. Okay, now I'll move to the last part. I hope we will, well, I hope I will be on time too. Okay, now when it comes to the end of analysis, or this phase in which this testimony occurs, which is subjective destitution, here I refer to Gabriel Tupinamba's formulation, who formulates it in 2 stages. I mean, how do we enter subjective destitution, and how do we get out of it? And somehow he divides them in 2 stages. The first, the entry into subjective destitution, he proposes to call it a naming at the level of S1. And then this naming gets formalized in testimony by an axiom. I will quote Tupinamba's a small passage of Tupinamba. I quote, naming is not simply a process of negation, but a process of naming at the point of negation that gives otherness a perimeter and situated determination. And then when he speaks about the axiom of testimony, he tells us that axiom implies more than this, more than naming, since its adoption brings out the otherness within otherwise primitive terms, introducing new unforeseeable variations and possible new operators into the original formalism. Now, The problem, I mean, although it's a very structured way of putting it, but Tupinamba's formulation poses a problem, which is this opposition between naming and formalization. How is it that a naming can translate into an axiom? And I work through this through the fact that an axiom works through an encounter of thought with the condition in knowledge that reveals, works through this contradiction in knowledge that reveals the contradiction in being. And this is, I refer to Todd McGowan in his reading of Hegel. So in axiom there is rather a contradiction. There is a relation between two contradicting entities which were supposed to be as one. And in the sense, in as much as it is contradiction that the axiom reveals, which entails reducing the authority of a name by its non-contradiction through its inscription in the opposition that renders it signifier, what an axiom is to operate, for it to have been a concept, is not a naming but rather an unnaming. So here I'd like to stress on this element because it has very big consequences when it comes to reading the end of analysis, when it comes to reading destitution and reading the so-called traversal of fantasy. And I will return to this later on. So to continue on this engagement with whether it is a naming or an unnaming that operates this gap and introduces us in subjective destitution. We can also ask the question in a slightly different manner. Is the construction leading to destitution a naming whereby a new discourse is initiated? Or an unnaming where a discourse is deconstructed and interpreted? So are we at the level of naming where we are entering again into meaning, or are we producing a gap which makes us exit again from meaning, from discourse? Another formulation of the same question would be, is the discourse of the analyst a discourse that can function all alone, as separate from the discourse of the master, or is it its obverse side, a discourse of gaps produced in the discourse of the master? And if we go back to one of the fundamental lines by which Freud defines interpretation, wo ist wahr, soll ich worden, where it was, I must come into being, which Mladen Dolar in Cogito and the subject of the unconscious translates into I as real was not there. So there is something in interpretation that is always retroactive, something in interpretation that is always proceeding not in the direction of a naming but of an unnaming, that where was the name I can come into being. And so if we take those two elements, we can say that if naming has had any importance in the analytic realm, it's precisely because in naming, unnaming can occur. whenever there is pointing at an S1 or a construction, going back to a master signifier, it's there that through this naming that unnaming can occur. Now I will move to the final part. I hope I can finish this in 5 more minutes, which are the consequences of this very troubling problem. I mean, do we do naming or do we do unnaming? This is what does the analyst do? Well, if we go through all of the arguments that bet on a naming, we'd see that this naming is rather used in a very particular manner that results in subjective destitution being framed or theorized as a kind of liquidation of transference. So it's, if it is a naming, if it is a stable production of a name, then it is a kind of liquidation. So whoever bets on the naming bets on the liquidation. And while, in fact, the question of the liquidation of transference is quite a problematic one, because what is not transference? Transference can only be amended, and one way of amending it is by the production of this desire of the analyst. This is one possible amendment, it's not the only one. And then, if we depart from naming, the idea of the traversal of the fundamental fantasy translates into an acceptance of castration, which we're falling back into Ferenczi's argument. And basically this traversal of fantasy is fantasy itself. I mean, if there is somehow a fantasy that is sustained all along the analysis, is basically this fantasy of traversing the fundamental fantasy. Although if we depart from unnaming, those two elements have completely different meanings, different way of unfolding. Subjective destitution would be not an occurrence, not a production, rather a return, a reoccurrence of an encounter with the fundamental deadlock. And by that, it would be a moment of mediation of a different entry into transference, a renewed entry into transference, which is different, which unfolds differently. While when it comes to the fundamental fantasy, the idea of unnaming opens it to endless articulation and rearticulation. And in a way, if there is something that can be traversed under this path of unnaming, it's basically the fantasy of the traversal of fantasy. At least there is one solid, concrete certainty one comes out with, which is that analysis is to be renewed constantly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mohamed, for this precious account of many crucial points of analysis. And I think this question of unnaming and naming is really something that also relates these reflections to many of the other papers that were given here in summer. So now we have time. We have till 2 o'clock. So please, if you have any questions, the audience, that's the moment.
Thank you, Mohamed. Great, as usual. I have 2 points. I mean, one is like, I guess, like pretty straightforward, and the other one is precisely relating to the last part, the naming axiom and naming. The point one, I think you put it very clearly that la passe, and hence in a sense also the act, is not about transmission, and specifically not about transmission of knowledge. And that is one of the accusations that you makes against Lacan very often. And I think the way you expose the fact that this is like a misapprehension often even among Lacanians, that it's all about transmission. And I thought the way you put it was excellent. So that was, like, I think, like the straightforward point. And let's go to the difficult point, because as Alenka says, I think like you were thinking about these issues theoretically in order to think clinically. And some of us are thinking the same issues from a merely theoretical perspective, but they are very, very close, I think. So let's see if I got you right. So I understand you as having, I mean, the question you're raising has 3 vertices. So you have the question of naming, the question of axioms, and then the question of whether naming is an unnaming. And I think this is really crucial. And in that sense, you are taking some distance from Tupinamba. Let me try to put it somehow, like try to propose something about that triangulation and see what you think about it. What about if everything is about the difference between naming and names? So naming give you names, and loosely speaking, those names are axioms somehow. So that's one possibility. But then the naming, and this goes back probably to Paris's intervention, prior to the axiom, you have a, let's call it, proto-axiomatic decision to axiomatize. So you have naming and this decision first in a logical time, and then you have names qua axioms. And then the further complication would be, where do you put the act? Because I would be tempted to say that the act is precisely what we just called naming, or the decision to axiomatize. But if that were the case, and then this is the question really, that naming is really an unnaming. So you'd have like stage 1, naming, decision to axiomatize, act, but naming becomes an unnaming, and then logical time, obviously we have a retroaction, etc., and then you get names, qua-axioms. I mean, it's really, I was just thinking whilst you're talking, but just to continue the conversation, basically. But, sorry, and just last point, also, I mean, Tupinamba book is great, but I also have that problem. I mean, there can be like a neat linear chronology between names and axioms, the way you put it. I think that there's a tension there. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for this. I mean, it's a brilliant extension of this reflection. I need to think about this. I need to think about this because I mean, I think one of the possible thoughts that we could entertain on this level is this example that Lacan gives about that this naming of the infinity of numbers in the transfinite number. And in that, yes, there is a sort of codification. There is a sort of inscription. Except that the transfinite number itself, does it function as a name? This is my trouble with taking naming as the primordial element, but I see also the opening that you're offering, that in a way there is a decision. But I'll need to think about this. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohamed. It was really, really great. And I'm also thinking along this conversation, if possible, because I wanted also to ask you what distinguishes, and now I'm consciously substantializing, an unname from a name. And I would have been very tempted to say the unname is an axiom. Is an axiom as a result of a decision or right. And then one ends exactly, I think, where Lorenzo pointed towards, because then unnaming does not simply produce a particularly decided indeterminability, something like that, right? But it's particular, and it's a single, it brings something into existence in the form of an unname. Right, and that one could modify Hegel's saying it's in names that we think. One could say, well, maybe it's in this sense it's in unnames that we think. Right, but then I think the unnamed would be exactly, I think, along the lines. It would be the result of some type of decision that is symbolized in a certain way that allows for a new form of indeterminability or repetition to emerge. Then calling it unnamed would simply mean, nevertheless, it's the act of, it's the result or materialization of some form of decision that precedes it. Right? And then one could say an unnamed is an axiom. Sorry.
I believe that, I mean, this correlation of unnaming with the act is, I think this is a point that is very essential. On the other hand, how I think about it is mostly in the sense that a name brings knowledge. Somehow, wherever there is a name, it unfolds in a certain discourse, in a certain filling of a certain gap. While in the unnamed, there's a gap that is left there as a gap. So I'm quite aligned with the path you're, but Lorenzo's stress on the idea that there is a decision prior to that intrigues me. I have to rethink about it, but yeah.
He uses the bar 0 as the name of the word that is the name of being. He basically makes it a self-referential name that indicates it has a meaning. Right? So something can result from it, but it is sort of symbolizes. Like one symbol, I think, what you're putting in figure out. Sorry.
I think I need to make myself clear, because I'm also trying to, like, overcome this tension in Tupinamba. So I'm not for the two stages. I call them two stages, but it's actually two sides of the same coin, right?
Yeah.
So it's not that you have the decision to axiomatize and then you have the axioms. When you decide to axiomatize, then you have the axioms. So going back to Frank, I'm totally okay to, to say there's no distinction between the names and the axioms in a certain, following a certain, there is theoretical distinction, but there is no linear temporality, which I think somehow is the problem with the way in which, however good the book is, Tupinamba phrases things,
Thanks.
Yeah, if I may just take the privilege of already holding the mic, I would also join this discussion. This is partly related to what you were all saying. Okay, but you emphasized naming as a kind of a necessary step of unnaming. So if there is, because I don't think this is exactly the same as the decision to, or would you say, there is, as if these were the two sides of the same coin, the naming and the very unnaming that takes place there. But actually, the real question, let's say, that I wanted to ask is, you emphasize this unnaming and cut as the concept of the end of analysis, which then kind of displays itself and continues elsewhere. And in your account, the accent was precisely on this it moves elsewhere and it restarts there, reinvents itself there. But is there anything as a kind of a structural difference that comes into play here because you did, let's say, end an analysis, or is it simply that, you, like, to put it very bluntly, you had this kind of pathology which came to this naming, unnaming, and now you move on to another? Or is there something that structurally, then through this repetition, makes a difference or functions differently?
Well, I would say that there is a difference. There is a difference, but somehow the dialectical framework is the same. So there is a difference which is being operated by repetition, and it's one stage of its unnaming, its articulation, but then it requires another articulation in different circumstances. And so I think I could answer your question shortly by saying both.
Okay.
I don't know if this is...
Thank you. That was a wonderful paper. It's actually a continuation of the same discussion in a sense. I was reminded of the way Badiou reads the end of analysis question and the act in the anti-philosophy seminar. And he talks about this kind of a scenario where the analysand would be pushed into a no-exit situation so as to be forced into an exit. But what is interesting, and I don't think Badiou goes into it, and this goes back to Alenka's point, that it's a forced choice, but this is not the forced choice of alienation. It is a kind of a forced choice, that the logic that Badiou works out there. But, I was reading that passage, I was thinking about how this would, if at all, go back to the forced choice of alienation. And that, I think, is connected with the question that Alenka is asking. What is there a structural difference between the repetition before the end and the repetition that happens after the end? Once something is isolated, a new S1, jouissance, some unnaming itself as a sort of isolation of something from the order of signifiers. So again, it's a comment. But it'll be very curious.
No, it's a very difficult question because on the one hand, yes, there is a difference, and there is an articulation of alienation that occurs in this formalization, in this construction. On the other hand, does that bring us out of alienation? I mean, there is a re-entry in this alienation, but in an articulated way, which itself requires further articulation. So, because as soon as we think of this idea that perhaps we could end it with alienation in some way, we're there in the traversal of fantasy, we're in the biggest risk of alienation, you know. So I think it's a very delicate question, which is very hard to put in a straight and direct answer. I think that I tried in this book to propose a trajectory from which an answer can be deduced, interpreted, but I find this question extremely difficult to answer in such a direct way, without falling into one of those two figures that
Thank you, Mohamed. So my question is also about naming, but in a completely different register, rather about pseudo-naming, because I want to take a moment to draw a relation between what you've described here in the past to what Kierkegaard does with his pseudonyms. And you and I have talked quite a bit about this move in writing, so I feel licensed to ask you a question about Kierkegaard. But in the past, the analysand is reduplicated in the passeurs, right? And this is meant to somehow restage the analysis and subject it as a sort of object, as you formulated. I wonder to what extent it could be argued that in some cases, Kierkegaard's use of pseudonyms is attempting that same type of reduplication structurally, and is trying to subject not a sort of object of thought or an object of knowledge or other traditional philosophical objects to scrutiny, but really to try and scrutinize a much more amorphous situation itself. So, in other words, to what extent does Kierkegaard sort of stand as another instantiation of what is being restaged in the operation of the Passe?
Thank you. Well, thank you. But I find it quite difficult to think of it. I mean, what I know from Kierkegaard, and I didn't really work a lot on Kierkegaard except for the concept of anxiety. But what I know about this usage of the name, that there is a doubling of the author, a doubling of the narrator. Am I right? Is this what you are referring to? And could you explain to me from this point what you're proposing?
I suppose,
I'm sorry.
I'm trying to explore the way in which there is a certain pass in this literary strategy, in the same way that we say that there could be a pass in analysis, which would somehow mark the production of something.
I mean, nothing comes to my mind. I apologize.
Food for thought.
Let me think about it more.
Yeah, it's actually kind of connected to what Holden was saying about literature, because listening to you, I really heard some resonance to Joan Kopchak's talk yesterday, specifically where she was talking about Kiarostami as allowing what is not there to come into view, and I just wondered if also some of her comments on Muslim Gnosticism, I think there was literally a sort of word that popped out of your talk was inexhaustible, and I think that Yesterday in Joan's talk, she said knowledge of God is not unattainable but inexhaustible in this tradition. And I guess I was just, these things were kind of things that I heard in what you were saying in relation to, at the end, in terms of this question of the act and naming being unnaming, and I guess an increase of knowledge. The thing Joan said about like an increase of knowledge of what one doesn't know or something, and then allowing what is not there to come into view.
Well, unfortunately, I wasn't here during John's conference, but I mean, on the topic of knowledge, I think one point that is important to depart from is that analysis does not produce knowledge. It's rather trying to make cuts in knowledge. And in this sense, when we speak about the unconscious inexhaustibility, we are speaking also about the inexhaustibility of knowledge. We cannot produce enough cuts in it. We cannot. So when it comes to the trajectory of analysis and to destitution, it's the furthest away from knowledge that one can imagine. It's rather on the complete opposite side. And in a way, if we can think that in this moment the analysand is able to formalize his analytic act, to develop his desire of the analyst, it's precisely that his relation to knowledge has been kind of amended. That this subject's supposed to know, he's able to occupy this position for another analysand while still being an analysand and still being in transference. So this is how I can think about this relation to knowledge. I hope I went close to what you were asking.
Well, the last question, very quickly.
Yeah, I try to be short. I just wanted to come back to the question of Passe in terms of the problem it raises for you and how far you're willing or how far you think those two need to be separated, the problem opened by Passe and the formal dispositif of Passe as it was historically articulated within the school, precisely. The school.
Yes, excuse me, but those two, what were those two? I'm sorry.
The problem you tried to articulate, namely the continuation starting from the end, and the historical dispositif, which is itself a formal dispositif.
Yes, sorry,
and there seems to be a certain consensus or recognition of the fact that, at least among non-Millerians, the school somehow seems to be saturated as an organizatorial dispositif in itself, which mediates between the discourse of the analyst and the discourse of analysis, more broadly speaking. But if that is the fact, and or if that is the case, how do we then work with this transition from naming and unnaming? Because it's not just a personal question. It's not just, if I understand you correctly, it is first and foremost a personal question for how to sustain the discourse of the analyst. But if Passe is about, or the end of analysis is also about tearing holes into the knowledge of analysis as it has historically developed, how to make that threshold or this if it's not a transmission of a knowledge, but the transmission of an impulse which knowledge has reached, how to go there? Or do you think this way is itself over?
Well, I think this is a really fundamental question, which of course I cannot really think of an answer for, but I can give the example of what historically happened, especially when it came to Lacan. I mean, if we start from the moment where this pass was, let us say, instituted, although it is exactly against the instituted, but I mean, it was itself an intended rupture, which after 5 years, Lacan was very, I mean, not happy at all about it. He was, and at around 10 years later, he stopped it. But before that, when he writes to his Italian counterparts in the Italian note, he makes a suggestion, I mean, and a very interesting suggestion. He practically told them, make a pass without a school. You know, just make a pass without an institution. If you can, just make a pass, and that's it. You know. Yeah. 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 No, of course. Then, so 10 years later, the pass was abandoned, and maybe 5 to 10 years later, the school was dissolved, and dissolved also as a rupture with a call to whoever has not contributed to making of this an institution, let him follow me again and prove to me that he's willing to produce gaps in knowledge rather than sustain them. So, I mean, your question reminds me of this constant invention of acts that Lacan has done, and this is only at the level of the political. If we go to the level of the theoretical, it's also even more intense than that. You know, all those this revision of his theoretical tools every 10 years, where there's almost a new language being used, each making a gap again and then turning itself into a structure, then another gap. So, I mean, I could say that if there is a way to continue, it's finding a way to make gaps. And that does not have a rule. I mean,
Thank you very much, Mohamed. I think this was a perfect end to this non-end, and to be continued this afternoon. Please join me in.